Excellent. Okay. All right, welcome everybody. Today's session is Board Basics, Come to Terms. If you're watching this live, again, you can ask questions during it. If you want to wait till after when I stop the recording, you can also ask questions then. And if you're not watching this live and you're watching the recording of it, which everyone who's signed up, I have your email, so I'll send that recording to. By all means, you can email me, ask me questions anytime. So who am I? I am Matt, the Terminator Corey. Say hasta la vista to your term issues. I really love doing anything compliance related. It's just something I've really fallen into and then dived deep. So yes, so this session is for everyone. And it can be either a great introduction if you're a new trustee, or a refresher on board basics for people that have been on the board for years. This session, when I put it together, it's based on many of the questions and issues that we get at the library system. So those frequently asked questions, right? And why is the session important? It's good to kind of understand really why we're doing this, why we're here today. It provides confidence in your operation. It reduces confusion and headaches in your board's governance of the library. And it also reduces risks. So what kind of risks am I talking about? Really ensuring that your board's practices hold up to any potential public scrutiny. That's really important. And while still kind of rare, this sort of scrutiny does still happen even in our area here in the North Country. So remember that it's ultimately the board's responsibility to make sure you're operating in compliance. Sometimes library staff also helps with that sort of thing, right? Where it's file management, you've got policies and bylaws and stuff like that. But really it's up to the boards, to make sure that all of those files are accessible and up to date and all of that, on the library's website too. Again, why is this session important? Library boards are very different than other nonprofit boards. Libraries have to comply with unique laws and regulations that may not apply to other nonprofits, right? For instance, open meetings law or public officers law. Those sorts of issues, you're, a nonprofit board that you may have experience with, that nonprofit probably doesn't have to deal with those sorts of unique things. Okay. Also, turnover is another reason why this session is important. With turnover, knowledge is lost and new trustees need to easily and quickly understand how the board operates. So reviewing and tightening up your bylaws, policies, and documents ensures the future success of new staff and trustees. Okay. Before we really dive deep, I just want to cover a few definitions. You'll probably already know these, but I'll cover them anyway. Also, I want to point out too that I will include the slides in my follow-up email to you, as well as the recording. So annual report, many of you already know what this is, but it's a report filed annually and submitted to the Division of Library Development. This contains information on the library operation, its performance, trustee information, finances, and more. And usually, your director is working on this in, late January, February, and the board approves it, right, in February, sometimes March. The charter. So this is the document of incorporation granted to an official public or association library by the New York State Board of Regents. This includes your library's original number of trustees, term length, and more, right? It's the actual document that makes you official. By having the charter, you can go on the school ballot, you can get construction fund, the construction grant funds, things like that. And then DLD, that's Division of Library Development. That's the division of the New York State Library within the New York State Education Department, responsible for statewide library services for the oversight of library funding and compliance. Okay, so I might mention these, well, I will mention these throughout the session, but it's good to just kind of have this understanding of the definitions before we do. Okay. Now we all know what bylaws are, but I think this is a really good definition that highlights some important aspects of them. Written bylaws clarify the rules by which the Board of Trustees operates and governs the library. They set the procedures for the smooth running of board business. As membership on the board changes over time, specifics and agreements may be forgotten. Bylaws are essential to assuring continuity and preventing disagreements and misunderstandings. Bylaws need to be reviewed and updated at least once every 5 years. So that review and updated comes from DLD, the Division of Library Development, minimum standard number 1, right? By having a charter, all libraries have to comply with those minimum standards, and all of our libraries do. So one of the reasons why I want to point out this definition, and it's going to be a consistent theme throughout this presentation, is that it really talks about the procedures for smooth running of board business. And over time, things might be forgotten. So this is really a chance to set up the future success of the trustees and assure continuity. So there may be things that you are required to have in your bylaws. Well, there are a lot of things that are required for your bylaws, but there is also optionally some language that you should include to make your life easier governing the library, to reduce headache, to reduce questions, just optional language. And I'll talk a little bit about some of that optional language that will make governing the library easier. Okay, so bylaws should be clear so there are no questions about how the board does business. It's good for everyone to be familiar with the bylaws and again, occasionally review them, but you have to do it at least once every 5 years. Your bylaws should address your questions about how the board conducts business. If your bylaws don't address your questions, it may be an opportunity to add or change language. Additionally, your bylaws must be in agreement with your charter, as well as open meetings law and other state or federal law. So for instance, public libraries have public officers law. Public officers law requires has the residency requirement, right? That you live within your library's chartered to serve area, the town, the city, whatever it might be, right? Bylaws do differ between libraries due to library type and more. So like I was just saying, association libraries don't have to comply with public officers law. So they do not have a residency requirement most of the time, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But public libraries do definitely have the residency requirement. So bylaws do tend to differ between libraries. We have a few school district public libraries where they're chartered to serve an entire school district. Those trustees are elected, for instance. So their bylaws will talk about that election process. Of course, at any time, and this is, again, something I'll mention several times throughout this presentation, if you have any questions about your compliance or those differences or your library type or anything like that, that's why consultants are here at the system to help you with that. Okay. What do your bylaws say? So this is a common response that we give when a library asks us questions. Typically, their own bylaws may have even a unique process or answer for that library. So, for instance, we have a trustee that has been absent. How do we handle that situation? What do your bylaws say? There's absolutely language and even some education law that can help deal with some of those situations. So yes, if you have a question about how to proceed, how to do board business, look at your own bylaws first and see what those bylaws say. Okay. There are some sample bylaws in the trustee handbook. I think many of you probably recognize this green book here. This is in the process of getting updated, and I believe there will be updates to the sample bylaws as well. But that is a good starting place to get some really basic core information. Okay. All right. So now, really getting into the meat and potatoes of this section. How many trustees serve? It seems like a really simple question. So the number of trustees. The number of trustees, think of it as seats, is originally stated in your library's charter. It might be 5 or 7. This number of trustees must be stated in your bylaws, right? Unless you've already amended your charter, that original document that started you, unless you've already amended your charter to have a range, this number cannot change without an amendment to that charter. So just like how your bylaws have to agree with the charter, your charter originally already says a few things. So that's your starting document. And then any change to that charter only comes with a charter amendment, which is a process that has to go to, DLD and the New York State Board of Regents. Okay. Also worth mentioning, the number of trustees or seats that are on the board does not change when there are vacancies. This number is reported to DLD in the annual report. So sometimes if a library board changes that number, NCLS questions it, DLD will question it, etc. Okay. An increasing number of our libraries have amended their bylaws to have a range of trustees. For example, 5 to 15, sometimes it's 5 to 9. What it basically does is you amend your original charter so that instead of it saying exactly 7 trustees, it'll have that range, 5 to 15, or 5 to 9, whatever it might be. The current number of trustees must be stated in your bylaws, even if you have a range. We encounter a lot of libraries who did, throughout the years, at some point, do this amendment process to their charter to have a range of trustees. Yet their bylaws at some point removed the actual current number of trustees. So you have to have that. So even if you have a range, the number of trustee seats does not fluctuate when there are vacancies. If you have a range, the current number of trustees doesn't change until the board approves the change and updates the language in their bylaws. Everybody's bylaws should have some language about how to amend the bylaws, how to change your own bylaws. That's the process that you have to follow. Typically what we see, and again, this is why you have to consult your own bylaws often, but typically that language for amending your bylaws has something along the lines of a change to the bylaws shall be proposed at a meeting and then voted upon at the next meeting, right? So you have to propose the change, but then give it another full meeting before you can actually make a motion to change the bylaws. Having an odd number of trustees is ideal as it's easier to meet quorums and prevent ties. I'll talk about that a little bit more in just a second here. So quorum, again, seems pretty basic, but there is a lot of confusion out there about this. Ed Law 226 states that a majority of the whole number of trustees, regardless of vacancies, shall be a quorum. Okay, so a quorum is the majority of the current trustees stated in your bylaws. So for instance, if you have a range of 5 to 15 in your bylaws, but your current number is 7, then your quorum, the majority of that is 4. The quorum, again, is unaffected by vacancies. Regardless of how many people show up to a meeting, a quorum, majority of the number of trustees stated in your bylaws, is required to have the meeting. So I think a lot of people, this is pretty basic. A lot of people do know this, right? Yeah, 7, we'll say trustees on the board. The quorum is 4. You got to have 4 people show up at the meeting. Here's where it gets a little confusing for people. For any motion to pass, a quorum, a majority of the number of trustees stated in your bylaws, has to approve it. So not only do you have to have 4 people show up in that instance, but 4 people also have to say yes to any motion, no matter who shows up at the meeting. If you've got 7 trustees on the board, you have to have at least 4 people vote in favor of a motion for it to pass. Board members also must be present to vote with acknowledgement to remote participation as open meetings law and executive orders permit, right? We saw a lot of that happen with the pandemic. I'll talk a little bit about the video conferencing aspect with open meetings law that changed about a year ago. But again, all the board members have to be present to vote in the sense that you can't just be like, hey, I can't make the meeting tonight, but as far as going on the school budget, you know, count me for a yes. You can't do that, right? If your quorum is not stated in your bylaws, consider adding the language that specifically says what the quorum is. Again, it might seem like a really basic thing, especially if you've been on the board for several years. But for somebody who's starting, for somebody who's just coming onto the board for the very first time and has maybe even never heard of this quorum concept before, having your bylaws state that you have a, you know, the library can have a range of 5 to 15 trustees. There are currently 7 seats on the board and 4 is the quorum. Having all that language in there makes it really clear for a new trustee. Okay, so just another example of this. The library has a range of 5 to 15 trustees. Stated in the bylaws are currently 7 trustees. There are 2 vacancies, so there are currently 5 active trustees. Despite those 2 vacancies, 4 trustees are considered a quorum, and 4 trustees must vote in favor of a motion to pass it. The library should, again, consider adding language to their bylaws stating that 4 is the current quorum. Okay. Just like I was mentioning with the open meetings law, over the pandemic, we had a lot of exceptions with video conferencing. And then the open meetings law, you know, this 103A last June 8th kind of changed things slightly. So while the entire board can no longer meet virtually like you were during the pandemic, if a board wants to allow an individual to attend remotely and adopts the resolution, the procedures, conducts the hearing, there's a whole thing that you have to do to allow remote participation. The individual must have a qualifying excuse as per the resolution and procedures that you've set forth in this. I don't think, you know, what's funny is I don't think any of our libraries did jump through all of these hoops for this, but they specifically talked about some requirements for quorum if you do decide to adopt the remote attendance here. While an individual may participate remotely, again, if you adopt this whole thing, the resolution procedures, do the hearing, all of that, while an individual may participate remotely, there must still be a physical quorum present at the regular meeting. So even if you were to jump through all this and allow somebody with a qualifying excuse to video conference in and participate, you still have to have a physical quorum present at the meeting. Again, if there are 7 seats on the board, then 4, the quorum must still be physically present for somebody to participate remotely. Okay. How long do trustees serve? Term lengths. Seems easy, not so fast. This section of the annual report is actually riddled with inconsistencies and errors between years. So we'll talk about some of the basics here. Term lengths are originally stated in the library's charter and bylaws, which again must match, right? Your bylaws and your charter must match there. Typically, as you know, that's 3 or 5 years. We do have some libraries, like we have a library, for instance, with 11-year terms, but typically the most common are 3 to 5. So it's okay if you have something else other than the 3 to 5. Every one of the terms starts in the same month and ends in the same month. For instance, all terms starting in January, and then all terms ending, 3 or 5 years later, or sometimes something different, in December. Term lengths are stated in the library's charter. Thus, a Board of Regents approved amendment is required to change the term length. For instance, changing from 5 years to 3 years. And if you are one of those boards that has a really long term, 7 years, something like that, Yeah, obviously, you may want to consider changing that. Term lengths continued. Terms never change, only the people filling them do. That's a quote from famous actor Tom Hanks. Every term a trustee serves will start and end consistently in the same respective months. For most, not all libraries with a calendar fiscal year, every term will start in January and end in December. So I say calendar fiscal year because we do have a handful, 6 libraries that have fiscal years that are June to May or July to June. So there are some exceptions there. So what if a trustee started in October? Yeah, the trustee started filling that seat in October, but the term started before that. They're serving the remainder of a term that started before them and was either vacant or occupied by another person who left it. Okay, so I hope this is helpful, but I kind of color coded an example here. This board has 5 members or seats for the example and 3-year terms. The dates below are not affected by any person, any name filling the seat. These just are the actual seats set in stone. So seat 1 and 2, January 2019 to 21. Then the next term after December 21 would be January 22 to December 24. With 5 members and 3-year terms, you can see the color coding every 2 out of every 3 years, you'll have 2 people expire at the same time, the orange and the blue. And then on that 3rd year, you'll only have 1 person expire, right? So this board is properly staggered. Staggered meaning I'll talk a little bit more about it, but staggered meaning the least amount of people are expiring at the same time as possible. Again, 5 seats, 3-year terms. This board should only have at most 2 terms expire at the same time. Okay. Consecutive terms. This can be really confusing for people, and I've got some remedy for it. Many bylaws state a maximum number of consecutive terms a trustee can serve. Your charter may or may not state that information. If your charter does state this, which is less common, then changing the number of consecutive terms would require a charter amendment. Anytime I refer back to a charter, you'll notice it's in orange here. Okay. If the charter does not state this, which is more common, the board may amend their bylaws without a charter amendment, may amend them talking about how many consecutive terms a trustee can serve. If there is no limit to how many consecutive terms a trustee can serve, then your bylaws should still state that to prevent any confusion. And again, seems to be kind of a common thing that comes up. Okay. Partial terms. Without specific language, it can be confusing whether a trustee's partial term counts towards the maximum number of consecutive terms. Consider clarifying this with some language to your bylaws. I found some really good examples of state governments that do this. This is very common with state governments because they really, really need that clarity, right? Here's some language from some examples there. Any person appointed or elected to fill a vacancy in the General Assembly and who serves at least 1/2 of a term of office shall be considered to have served a term. Terms are considered consecutive unless they are at least 4 years apart. So they really go into detail there. Any person appointed or elected to fill a vacancy in the House of Representatives or the State Senate for a period greater than 1/2 of a term of such office shall be considered to have been elected to serve 1 time in that office. Okay, so basically in these examples, they're saying if you've served the majority of a term, that'll count as a full term regarding your, how many consecutive terms that you can do. Okay. Then there's also the question of time off. Some trustees who have served their maximum consecutive terms, maybe that's 2 or 3, may want to continue to serve. While they can't immediately serve again, your bylaws may optionally state a time period before they are eligible to serve again. This could be a year off or more. And again, another example, terms are considered consecutive unless they're at least 4 years apart. Okay. Staggering terms. This is something that a lot of boards need help with. And Dawn Vincent, my coworker here, is also in the session. She is really good at helping boards stagger their terms so that you don't have 3 people or 4 people expiring at the same time on a 5-person board, right? Again, the point of staggering terms is so the least possible amount of terms expire each year. It makes sure, and the reason why we do this is because it makes sure that the least amount of trustee experience and knowledge is leaving the board at one time, right? It becomes a real massive recruitment issue for any board when they got to suddenly get 3 people, to fill seats at the same time. And it also, again, it reduces the burden of board recruitment. If your terms are not staggered the best way possible, your board may vote to change term dates in your bylaws for the purpose of staggering terms. Follow the bylaws amendment procedure in your bylaws. A charter amendment is not required, though, and Dawn can help with this. You can refer back to your original charter to see how terms were staggered originally. Again, when your library forms and you look at that charter paperwork, it'll literally show, 100 years ago, the names of everybody who started. And then all of those people were originally staggered. It's just because of confusion and, again, turnover and things like that, somehow the years get screwed up a little bit over time. And so, again, that is something that NCLS can absolutely help you with and get you perfectly staggered with your board.
Matt, do you mind if I say something regarding the charter? The charter sometimes will specifically tell how many are to expire each year. So sometimes it'll tell just the years that they started so you can develop this staggering, but sometimes this specific language says 2 are to expire each year. And if you currently have 3, we're going to want to correct that and get it back to compliance.
Yep. And again, with Dawn, she is great at looking at that original charter, figuring that all out. We have they're pretty poorly scanned, but they're PDFs of your original charter language and everything, the paperwork. And we can look through all that to figure out exactly what Dawn was just mentioning here. Should you want to stagger your board's terms, a vote and putting the exact staggering language in your bylaws is required. And NCLS can help with that language. There's even a little language that can put the trustee names and those specific staggered terms in your bylaws with an expiration as well, right? So that when it's no longer relevant, everybody's filled their readjusted terms so that everything is staggered specifically. There comes a point where that no longer is, that specific language in the bylaws is no longer relevant because everybody just is on fresh terms that are, staggered perfectly. I hope I explained that correctly. Staggering terms. So how do you know if your terms should be staggered? Look at your board's documentation to determine if you have more trustees than necessary expiring from your board in a single year. NCLS, again, has some excellent language to put in the bylaws. We'll guide you through what can be a pretty complex process. This is, I will say it can be, looking at the old charter work and plotting things out, it can be a little bit complex, but again, we just do it all for you. So again, a second example, this board has 7 members and seats. They have 5-year terms. The dates are not affected by the person filling the seat. So again, color coded here. So Out of those 5 years, 2 people expire, then 1. With 7 seats and 5-year terms, this board should only have at most 2 terms expire at the same time. Okay. Terms, no exceptions. Unfortunately, you cannot make exceptions to your bylaws for convenience. You cannot extend or shorten someone's term for convenience. And you cannot let someone serve a consecutive term if your bylaws state otherwise, right? We get this question all the time, and we know how hard it is to recruit people, especially when you've got somebody who's a really, really active, helpful member of the board, and you know their time has come. Unfortunately, there's no wiggle room there. There may be, yeah. I'll just leave it at that. There's no wiggle room per se. Okay, so how do we keep track of all of this? The seating chart. So it's not a seating chart like literally where somebody physically sits, you know, at your big table. But sometimes a seating, you know, a seating chart can help trustees stay on track. This is an internal document, just for the board's eyes, that shows the term and duration details of each seat on the board and the person filling it. Terms are, again, much like seats. The seat always runs the same duration. Trustees may come and go filling that seat. You may consider including the seating chart on the back of every agenda. This document can be as complicated or as simple as you'd like, but should state the necessary information to keep you on track. So this is one that this is a simple version of a seating chart that I include on the back of the agendas for the Central Library Advisory Committee, or the CLAC. We're just a committee, right? But we have 2-year terms and two consecutive. You can serve 2 consecutive terms. So we have the name of the person, what their first term was, and when their second term is, and then the dates there, right? First term, second term. For this committee, they also have to represent each county, right? So that's why that's in there. But again, you could have something like this. It's super clean. It's super simple. You can put it on the back of every agenda, and then every meeting is always on the same exact page about who is expiring when. And again, it can really help with the recruitment issue too, because 6 months ahead of somebody expiring, you can really know exactly where you are and then start the recruitment process. Okay. We do have other seating charts too that are more complex, but they are really good for keeping a history of who's filled exactly what seat as well. And Dawn is an excellent help with that. And again, that's just something that NCLS can do for you to put you on the right track. Okay. What are other considerations for those trustees serving? Okay. Other requirements for trustees. Residency requirements, just like I was saying at the beginning of the session. All public library trustees must live within the boundaries of the municipality they serve. Sometimes that municipality is a town, a city. For village libraries, they can come from the town. And again, that's where this comes from is public officers law. Public libraries, not association libraries, have public officers law. If you're not sure what type of library you are, if you're an association or a public library, you can just reach out to us and just ask. Yeah, that public officers law, it's the same exact law as like municipal boards have to follow, right? Whereas if you're on a town board, you have to also reside within that town. Okay. It's less common, but even some association libraries may have specific requirements such as residency, as well as representation from certain local organizations written into your bylaws. You're going to want to check on that. I think we've got a few I can think of that are association libraries that still have the requirement. Again, they're choosing to have, they're not forced by a public officers law, but these association libraries are choosing to have that residency requirement. But again, if that's what's in the bylaws, then you have to govern within those rules, those bylaws that are approved by that board, right? Okay. Any questions so far? I know I'm kind of just ripping through all this. Okay, awesome. Oath of office. The oath of office also comes from that public officers law. That oath is required for all public library trustees. Again, if you're a municipal library, you're a school district public library, or special legislative, then you have to do that oath of office. This is a point of confusion and sometimes a question that we get. Trustees should take a new oath of office every time they begin a new term. The oath is required again by public officers law for all public, not association library trustees. But so at the time, at the beginning of every new term, right? So you've got 5-year terms. You do the oath of office. Your term expires 5 years later, and then you do the oath of office. Also, if you're filling a partial term, you want to do the oath of office. The oath must be filed within 30 days of commencing the term. Okay? What filing means is it basically ends up with the county clerk eventually, but typically these public libraries submit the oath to their municipal clerk, your village clerk, whatever it might be. But eventually they do get to the county clerk. That's where they're kept. And again, this is actually right in public officers law. Failure to do so may vacate the position, right? Sometimes, for whatever reason, the oath just isn't done within that 30 days. And that's just what it is. It's not ideal. But again, if there's public scrutiny that happens for some reason, maybe somebody's upset about something with the library, and this is something that they want to contest, that there's potential for that. Oath dates are reported to the Division of Library Development on the annual report. Again, the report that you file each year. So make sure your oath dates are within 30 days of the term start date. Again, it's something when I review annual reports, I tend to look at, because if somebody started in January, but they didn't do the oath until April, if it says somebody started in January, but they didn't do the oath until April, it can be a little problematic, right? When I send out these slides, there are a few links in here. I've got a link to more about oath of office right here if you've got any more questions on that. Sometimes association libraries do an oath. Again, it is optional. If it is optional for the association libraries, and it's not a bad idea. It is a nice practice to have. But the majority of our association libraries are not required to do an oath of office and do not do an oath of office. Okay. Absences and misconduct. If you don't have this language, consider adding it to your bylaws to address absences and misconduct. We actually get questions about this. I don't want to say frequently, but it is one of the more popular questions that libraries come to this with. Ad Law 226, Subdivision 4. If any trustee shall fail to attend 3 consecutive meetings without excuse accepted as satisfactory by the trustees, he shall be deemed to have resigned and the vacancy shall be filled. So that's actually right in education law. And you can put that in your bylaws. But you can also have something more strict than that if you want to. It just has to either be that or more strict. And again, the language can change there just so long as it has that same intent. The board may remove this too. The board may remove a trustee for misconduct, incapacity, neglect of duty, or refusal to carry into effect the library's educational purposes as are provided in Ed Law 226 subdivision 8. Okay. Again, unfortunately, this question has come up, a few times. So you might not have any issues right now, but maybe some years down the road, you do get a trustee that's just, you're not pulling their weight, or is maybe doing something that falls into one of these categories here. It's great to have that language in there just to be prepared. And again, it's in education law, so it's something that your library would have access to, or the board would have access to these these laws backing them up anyway. Okay. So I just want to recap a little bit too. Again, the number of trustees is absolutely in your charter. The term length is in your charter. Consecutive terms, typically not in your charter, but it's a great idea to have specific and sometimes extra language to really define what is it, how many consecutive terms, what amount of a partial term may count towards it being a full term. And again, oath of office required for public, not associations, though some chose to do them. Okay. Again, you may have questions or even unique circumstances. Just reach out to your consultant and we'll set you, put you on the right track here. Sometimes we have a lot of libraries, and I think for the most part, this is a good practice. We have a lot of libraries and trustees who call neighboring libraries, staff and ask questions. Well, how do you do this thing? It's a great idea, except for sometimes just because of the type of library that they are, they might have something actually legally different that they're required to do. Again, some of the practices may be a lot of the questions and circumstances that you have are probably something that we've seen a bajillion times. So we can kind of give you the best practice for solving your issue or giving you an answer. Okay. So I do want to give one little nod to the annual report here. Of course, libraries just finished this up a couple months ago. Again, in both the North Country Library System and the Division of Library Development annual report review process, there are frequently errors and inconsistencies between years in the trustee section. This past year, DLD has been stricter than ever reviewing annual reports. And again, these are submitted annually to DLD. The annual report asks, does your library have a range of trustees? How many voting positions? Term length, right? 3 years, 5 years. And for each individual trustee, term beginning, the month and year, term expiring, month and year, the date the oath of office was taken, whether or not they're serving a full term. And if not, you add a note that the trustee's filling the remainder of that specific person's term, or if the term was vacant, which was to run from, January, whatever, to December something. And then whether or not it's a new trustee. It is really good to review that section carefully. And it's good to stay engaged in your own library's annual report review process. Internally, an accurate annual report for your library, an accurate annual report can be useful for answering questions regarding the history of a trustee's service, questions the public might have, and more, right? So again, your annual report, very important. You're putting all of that information in there. We try our best to review those reports and make sure that the information is consistent year to year. But sometimes without a seating chart, for instance, that information just kind of gets lost. And yes, it is. Again, usually annual reports can be a great place for answering questions, but only if the data is accurate. Okay, so we've pretty much I've got a couple questions that at least I'm seeing in the chat. One question was, should the Board of Trustees approve and accept the annual report? Absolutely. That's actually in part 12. It's, oh gosh, is it like 1239, I think, is there's an, or maybe it's like 1240, 1241. It's an assurance date. It's literally the actual date that the board had a meeting and approved the annual report. So you should be looking at those sections, reviewing, making sure that your dates, your oath of office, all of that are right, that they're consistent. Yes, you have to approve the annual report. Okay, awesome. So yeah, we're actually pretty much towards the end of it, end of the session right now. What's next? Looking ahead, you're going to want to review your charter and any amendments to that charter and your bylaws. If you have trouble finding that and accessing it, again, we got it all at the system. We can help you, email you, PDFs, all that. Update bylaws and other policies or documents if necessary. Again, you do have to update your bylaws and your policies at least every 5 years, or I should say you have to review them at least every 5 years. But it's a good idea to, fresh off of this class, maybe look at the bylaws and some other policies. Again, optionally creating a seating chart. There should at least be some documentation that shows all the terms and who's filling them. You should have some master document that makes it easy for your board to determine who's filling what term and how long they have left. And again, there's some stuff that's required to be in your bylaws, but then there's always an opportunity to make sure that the language is more clear, especially for a new trustee coming on who's maybe never served on a board before. So consider changes that would improve the board's function. This includes making recruitment easier, attendance, the number of trustees, especially if you have trouble meeting quorum, and more, right? So if you do have, for instance, like an even number of trustees, consider whatever steps you're going to have to take to get to an odd number.
Hello.
Oh, yes, hi.
Yep.
Carolyn, do you have a question?
Yeah, right. Oh, okay.
Yes, awesome. Okay, and again, beating a dead horse here, but I can't I can't stress this enough that we've done full reviews and makeovers of library bylaws. Please feel free to submit them to us, and we'll make suggestions that ensure you're in compliance. Literally, we've had some really actual great opportunities to do what we consider, Dawn especially, a full makeover of bylaws where everything just gets organized and even formatted in a much easier to read and understand way. So yeah, even if your bylaws have everything they need, we'll also suggest best practices for formatting, organization, dates and amendments, how those are reflected in your bylaws, optional additions, and more. The goal is a set of bylaws that makes the board's job of governing easier and more efficient, less headaches, just clarity. Okay, awesome. Hey, that's it for me. I want to thank everybody for attending the class and for your service as a trustee, because I'm betting that when you signed up to be a library trustee, you did not realize what sort of challenges would be presented, but hopefully you're feeling that it is really meaningful work. And certainly we here at the system really appreciate everything that the trustees do for our libraries. It means a lot. So
Thank you, Matt.
absolutely. Yep. And I'm going to stop the recording here just in case. Once I figure out how to do it. Okay, here we go.